Relay Point Kestrel was not a beautiful place, but it was alive. It floated in the dark between star systems like a massive metal seed, spinning slowly to keep gravity working on its lower decks. 14 different atmospheric zones ran through its corridors like veins. The air in some sections smelled like rain. In others, it smelled like burnt copper or warm soil. The lights changed color depending on which corridor you were in, because different species needed different light to feel comfortable. Some creatures could not see in the wavelengths humans used. Some could see far beyond them. The station had been built to hold all of them, and somehow, impossibly, it did. Daniel Cole had lived on Kestrel for 3 years. He was a structural engineer. That which meant that when something cracked or bent or broke inside the enormous body of the station, he was one of the people called to fix it. He was 34 years old, medium height, with hands that were always a little roughened from work. He did not say much. He did not need to. The people who worked alongside him had learned early on that Daniel Cole was the kind of man who showed up on time, fixed the problem, and went home. There was something steady about him that people trusted without quite knowing why. His wife, Laura, was different from him in the best possible way. She was a xenolinguist, which was a fancy word for someone who spent her days learning how other species spoke and thought and understood the world. She worked for the Cooperatives Integration Bureau, that which meant her job was to sit in a room with beings who had claws or 6 eyes or no mouth in the human sense, and find a way to make meaning travel between them. She was good at it. She was warm and careful, and she paid attention to things most people walked past. The aliens she worked with respected her, some of them by their own cultural standards were fond of her. Their apartment was on level 9, which was one of the human residential zones. It was small, but they had made it feel like home. Laura had put up photographs. Daniel had fixed every little thing that was loose or wobbling or making a sound it should not make. On Tuesday evenings, they ate dinner together at the common table on the promenade level, because the food stall run by a pair of elderly Thessari sold something close enough to a rice dish that Laura loved. From back on Earth, on the morning everything changed. Daniel was already deep in Cargo Bay 12 before most of the station had finished its breakfast cycle. A support strut along the eastern wall had developed a hairline fracture that the automated system had flagged at low priority, but that Daniel, when he read the report, had bumped to high. Hairline fractures in a cargo bay that moved containers the size of small houses were not low priority in his opinion. He was up on a scaffold when the Vrakti dock crew arrived to begin the morning's unloading. The Vrakti were a large species, reptilian, heavily built, with natural plating across their shoulders and upper arms that looked like armor because once, very long ago, it had been. They moved through the bay with the ease of creatures who had never once in their lives worried about whether they were big enough to handle whatever was in front of them. They did not talk much among themselves. They communicated in short sounds and gestures. They ignored Daniel completely, which was fine with him. He ignored them back and kept working. The fracture was deeper than the scan had shown. He spent 2 hours on it, cutting away the damaged material and fitting a replacement section. The work required patience. The scaffold was not comfortable. His knees ached by the time he climbed down, and he was thinking about the coffee he was going to make himself back at the apartment. When his comm unit buzzed, it was a message from Laura. It said something happened, I am okay, come when you can. Daniel read it once, and then he read it again. He stood very still for a moment in the middle of the cargo bay while the Vrakti moved enormous crates around him like he was a small rock in a fast river. Then he put his tools back in his bag with the same careful movements he always used. He logged off the scaffold system. He signed the maintenance record for the strut. He walked out of the cargo bay at exactly the pace he always walked. His face did not change, but something behind it did. The promenade level of Kestrel was the widest open space on the station. It ran nearly a quarter-mile end to end with a ceiling high enough that several species who found enclosed spaces uncomfortable could breathe easily there. Market stalls lined both sides, selling food and tools and fabrics and small objects whose purpose was not always obvious to human eyes. The floor was pale gray composite and always busy with foot traffic from a dozen different species going about their mornings. Laura had been crossing the promenade at its busiest hour. She often did. Her office was on the far side, and she liked to walk rather than take the transit tubes because she said the walk reminded her that the universe was large and interesting. The Vrakti delegates' procession had come through without any announcement. This was permitted under Cooperative Protocol 7, an old rule that gave senior diplomatic representatives the right of unobstructed passage through public areas. In practice, it meant that a group of large armored beings moved through a crowd at full pace, and everyone else moved out of the way or got moved. Laura had been looking at her tablet when the procession came around the curve of the promenade. She stepped aside, but not fast enough, and one of the junior aides in the group shoved her. With one arm, she stumbled hard into a market stall. The Thessari vendor made a startled sound. Laura caught herself on the edge of the stall and turned, and that was when she saw Vrakul. He was the head of the delegation, tall even for a Vrakti, with a broad, flat face and eyes the color of old copper. He had seen her stumble. He was looking at her now with an expression his species used for things they found amusing, in the way a person finds a tripping child amusing, small and harmless and not worth real attention. He backhanded her. It was not a full strike. By Vrakti standards, it was barely anything. By human standards, it split her lip and put her on the floor of the promenade in front of dozens of witnesses. The promenade went quiet in the way that large spaces go quiet when something wrong has happened. For a moment no one moved. Vrakul turned and walked on. His procession followed. The sound came back to the promenade, slowly, like air filling a space that had just been emptied. Laura got up. Her lip was bleeding. She looked around at the faces watching her, human and alien, both, and she did not say anything. She picked up her tablet from where it had fallen. She asked a Thessari bystander, calmly and politely, to please hand her the small translation device that had skidded under his cart. He handed it to her with two of his 4 hands, and his expression, in the way of his species, communicated something close to shame as she thanked him. She walked to the medical bay. She sat in the waiting area and pressed a cloth to her lip and sent her husband a message. It said, "Something happened. I am okay. Come when you can." She chose those exact words because she knew him. She knew that if she said what had actually happened, he would run. And Laura Cole did not want her husband to run anywhere. She wanted him to walk the way he always walked, slow and steady, and arrive with his head clear. She sat in the waiting area and watched the medic's door and pressed the cloth to her lip and waited for the man she had married to come through the door at the end of the corridor. On the scaffold in Cargo Bay 12, Daniel had already started walking. The medical bay on level 6 was a clean, quiet place. It smelled like filtered air and something faintly medicinal that had no exact human equivalent. The lights were kept low and even, which most species found calming. There were 4 waiting chairs along one wall, and Laura Cole was sitting in the second one from the left when Daniel walked through the door. He saw her lip first. The medic had already cleaned it and applied a sealing strip, but there was still a small bruise forming at the corner of her mouth. Daniel sat down in the chair beside her. He did not say anything right away. He just looked at her face for a moment, the way a person looks at something they care about when it has been damaged. Then he took her hand. She told him what happened, all of it plainly, without making it bigger or smaller than it was. She told him about the procession, the shove, the fall, and then the moment Vrakko turned and looked at her. She told him about the backhand. She used simple words because the simple words were the accurate ones. Daniel listened. He did not interrupt. He did not ask her to repeat anything. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he asked her if she was in pain. She said not really. He nodded. He held her hand. After a while, the medic came out and explained that the lip would heal clean within 2 days, that there was no damage to her jaw, and that an incident report had been filed under cooperative protocol. The medic used the word regrettable. She said the word the way people say words when the word is all they have to offer. Daniel thanked her. He stood up and kissed Laura on the forehead. He told her he would be back for dinner. She said okay. She watched him walk out of the medical bay, and she did not try to stop him, because she knew there was no stopping a man who had already decided. Commander Oren Lask had been running security on Relay Point Kestrel for 9 years. Before that, he had spent 20 years in the Earth Defense Corps, which had left him with a permanent limp in his left leg and a very clear understanding of what real trouble looked like before it announced itself. He read the incident report within 40 minutes of it being filed, and he went to see Laura before he did anything else. She gave him her account the same way she had given it to Daniel. Clear, steady, no drama. Lask wrote every word in his personal log rather than the official one because he already had a feeling the official one was going to be complicated. And then he went to the Vrakti diplomatic suite on level 11. The suite took up most of one corridor. It was customized to Vrakti atmospheric preferences, which meant the air was drier and slightly warmer than the rest of the station. There were 2 guards at the entrance, large even by Vrakti standards. Lask had met them before at routine security walkthroughs. They knew who he was. He asked to speak with Delegate Vroth Call regarding the morning's incident on the promenade. One of the guards told him the delegate was unavailable. Lask said he could wait. The guard told him the matter had already been reviewed by the Vrakti legal attaché and that no violation of cooperative law had occurred. Lask asked to see that in writing. A document was produced within 10 minutes. It was 6 pages long. It cited Cooperative Protocol Gray Zone Clause 7.4, which covered unsanctioned physical contact between a member species representative and a non-member citizen in a shared public space during an authorized rite of passage event. The language was dense and circular and had clearly been written a long time ago by someone who had never imagined it would be used to cover a delegate striking a woman in front of 100 witnesses. Lask took the document. He read it, standing in the corridor. Then he folded it, put it in his jacket, and walked back to his office. He sat at his desk for a while. He was not angry exactly. He had been doing this work long enough that the specific shape of this situation was familiar to him. Powerful party does wrong thing. Legal structure built by powerful parties covers it. Document appears. Everyone waits for process. Process takes a long time. Nothing changes. What was different this time, Lask thought, was the husband he had seen Daniel Cole around the station for 3 years. He knew the type, not the type that made noise, the type that paid attention, the type that fixed things, the type that when something crossed a certain line did not get loud, got quiet. In a new way. Lask pulled up Daniel's station file. Structural engineer, contract renewal. 3 times, no violations, no incidents, commendations from 2 different department heads for work done above expectation. A completely ordinary record. The record of a man who caused no trouble. Lask closed the file. He looked at the gray zone document on his desk across the station in the Thesari Diplomatic Observation Office. On level 10, the advisor Senova was having a conversation she had been dreading. She had requested an emergency session with the Cooperative Station Council to raise what she called a species response concern. The council had agreed to meet, which meant 4 senior representatives of 4 different species sitting around a low table in a room that smelled of recycled air. Senova was Thesari, which meant she was smaller than most of the species in the room and had large dark eyes that gave her face an expression of permanent, careful attention. She had spent 11 years studying human behavior. She had written 2 papers on it. She was one of perhaps 30 non-human beings in the cooperative who genuinely understood what humans were. She told the council that the Gray Zone Clause had now been applied for the first time in cooperative history unto an incident involving a human citizen. She told them that human behavioral models did not respond to harm against a bonded partner the way other species did. She used calm language. She cited her own research. She explained that human patience, which was real and considerable, had a specific threshold, and that what distinguished humans from most of the other species in the cooperative was not that they lacked a response to that threshold being crossed, but that their response was not predictable by standard models. The council listened. They were polite. They asked a few questions, and then they voted to allow the legal process to proceed as normal because the Vrakti trade relationship generated significant portion of Kestrel's operating revenue and disrupting it. Over one incident involving one human. Woman seemed, yes, in the cold arithmetic of the council room, like an overreaction. Senova thanked them for their time. She walked out. She went directly back to her office and pulled up her emergency contact protocols, and she began, quietly and without explaining herself to anyone, to make sure they were all current. In the common corridor outside the residential zone on level 9, Daniel Cole was walking back toward the apartment he shared with his wife. He was not walking fast, he was walking at the pace he always walked. His tool bag was over one shoulder. His face was calm. He had already decided everything. He had decided it the moment he read the message in Cargo Bay 12. Everything since then had just been waiting. He stopped at the apartment, put his tool bag inside, washed his hands at the sink, soaped, and then turned around and walked back out into the corridor. Not toward the apartment level, toward level 11. He already knew which corridor. He had walked past it before on routine station checks. He already knew the guards rotated at certain hours. He already knew the layout of the diplomatic wing from the structural schematics he had accessed 3 months ago, when a ventilation fault needed tracing. Through that section, Daniel Cole did not run, he walked. Steady, even unhurried. He had somewhere to be. The corridor on level 11 was quieter than the rest of the station. The Vrakti preferred it that way. They had paid for additional sound dampening to be installed in the walls when they first took the diplomatic suite, which meant that the usual hum and murmur of kestrel life stopped at the corridor entrance like a wave hitting a wall. Past that point, everything was dry and still and slightly too warm. The two guards at the entrance saw Daniel coming from a long way off. A human male, medium height, wearing a work jacket with a station maintenance patch on the shoulder, a tool belt at his hip. No weapons. He was walking at a steady pace, and he was alone, and there was nothing about him that triggered the threat responses. The Vrakti had evolved over millennia. He was, by every physical measure they possessed, not dangerous. He stopped in front of them and spoke in common tongue, which was the shared language of the cooperative, the one all species learned as a second or third or seventh tongue. He said, "My name is Daniel Cole. I am a structural engineer on this station. This morning, Delegate Vrath Call struck my wife on the promenade. I would like to speak with him." One of the guards made a sound that was the Vrakti equivalent of a short, dismissive laugh. The other looked at Daniel the way one looks at something very small that has made an unexpected noise. They let him in. This was entirely consistent with Vrakti cultural logic, which held that allowing a small creature to stand before a great one and voice its complaint was a form of generosity. It did not occur to either guard to be concerned. The inner room of the diplomatic suite was large by kestrel standards. The ceiling had been raised by 3 ft to accommodate Vrakti proportions. The furniture was low and heavy. The lighting was amber, which gave everything a slightly orange cast. Vrath Call was at the far end of the room, standing near a window that looked out into the dark between stars. He turned when Daniel entered. Vrath Call was a big creature. He was nearly 7 ft tall and broad in the way that comes from natural armor, not just muscle. His face was flat and scaled, and his Copper-colored eyes had a quality too. Them that his species used in negotiations. A steady, heavy stare designed to communicate that he was the largest thing in a room and had always been the largest thing in every room he had ever entered. He looked at Daniel Cole. Daniel looked back at him. What happened in the next 11 minutes was not recorded cleanly. The security feed covered the entrance to the suite, but the interior camera had been disabled weeks earlier at the Vrakti delegation's request, and which was within their diplomatic rights. What the feed showed was Daniel walking in, the door closing, and then 11 minutes of nothing. No sounds came through the dampened walls, no alarm was triggered, no one called for help. Daniel walked out at the 11-minute mark. He was physically unchanged. His jacket was not torn, he was not breathing hard. He walked back past the two guards at the same steady pace he had walked in. Neither guard moved to stop him. They watched him go with an expression that for Vrakti was unusual. It was not quite confusion, and it was not quite unease. It was the expression of creatures who had expected one thing and received something else and had not yet finished deciding what to do about it. Inside the suite, Vrathkal was standing in the corner nearest the window. He was not injured, yet there was no physical damage to anything in the room. But he was standing in that corner, and he was not speaking, and the quality of his stillness was different from the comfortable stillness of a large creature at rest. It was the stillness of something that has been shown a door it did not know existed and is not sure it wants to walk through. Commander Lask got the call from a junior security officer who had been monitoring the Level 11 feed as part of routine watch. The officer flagged it not because anything violent had happened, but because something about the sequence felt wrong in a way he could not fully articulate. A human civilian had walked into the Vrakti diplomatic suite alone, stayed 11 minutes and walked back out. And now the suite was showing no movement at all on the passive thermal sensors, which meant Vrathkal had not moved in over 10 minutes. Lask was in the security office when Daniel arrived. Daniel came in through the main entrance, walked up to the duty desk, and told the officer on duty that he wanted to speak with Commander Lask. He said it was about an incident in the Vrakti suite. He was calm, he was not out of breath. The officer, who was young and had not been on the station long, looked at him for a moment and then called Lask. Lask came out of his back office and looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at him and said, "I went to see Delegate Vrathkal. I want to tell you exactly what I said and what I did. I would like to do that now before anything else happens." Lask looked at him for another moment. Then he said, "Come on back." They sat in Lask's office, and Daniel told him everything. He was precise. He did not skip anything, and he did not add anything. He described walking to the suite, what he said to the guards, how he was let in. He described the room, he described Vrathkal, and then he described what he had said. He had not threatened Vrathkal. He had not raised his voice. He had not touched him. He had stood a few feet away from the delegate, and he had spoken to him in common tongue, slowly and clearly. And he had explained something. He had explained what Laura meant to him, not in large emotional language, in plain words. He told Vrathkal that Laura was the person he had built his life around. That she was the reason he had taken a contract on a station in deep space, rather than staying closer to Earth. That she was the best thing he knew. He said this the way a person states a fact. And then he explained what the morning had cost, not in terms of pain though. He mentioned that in terms of what it meant when a creature with power used it on something he loved simply because it could. He said that he understood cooperative law and that he understood the gray zone clause and that he was not standing there to argue about either of those things. He said he was standing there because he needed Vrathkal to understand something that the law did not cover. He said, "You hit her because she was small and you were large and there was no one in that corridor you were afraid of. I want you to understand that you were wrong about that last part." He had not moved while he said it. He had not raised his hands. He had simply stood there, in the same way he stood when he was looking at a structural problem he had already worked out how to fix. Completely still, completely certain. Lask listened to all of it. When Daniel finished, Lask sat back in his chair and was quiet for a while. Then he asked, "Is he hurt?" Daniel said no. Lask asked, "Did you touch him?" Daniel said no. Lask nodded slowly. He looked at his desk, then he looked at Daniel and said, "I have to hold you pending review." "You understand that?" Daniel said. "I know, I came here so you could." He said it without any sharpness. It was just a fact. He had come to the security office because turning himself in before the complaint was even filed was the right thing to do. It had not occurred to him to do anything else. Lask had him processed and placed in a holding room, in which on Kestrel was less a cell and more a plain room with a cot and a locked door. Before the door closed, Daniel asked one thing. He asked if someone could get a message to Laura telling her he would be late for dinner. Lask said he would handle it himself. After the door closed, Lask went back to his office and sat at his desk for a long time. Through the window he could see the Level 11 corridor feed on his monitor. The thermal sensor in the Vrakti suite still showed Vrathkal standing in the same corner. He had not moved in 40 minutes. By the time the station lights shifted into their evening cycle, the story had already moved beyond level 11. It moved the way things move on a station where 14 species live in close quarters and nothing stays private for long. A word here, a message there, and a security aide who mentioned something to a Thessari colleague who passed it along to someone else. By morning, it had a shape that everyone on Kestrel recognized, even if they were hearing different versions of it. What they all agreed on was this: a human man had walked alone into the Vrakti diplomatic suite, spent 11 minutes and walked back out. And the senior Vrakti delegate, a creature that other species ambassadors had spent years trying not to anger, had not moved from a corner of his own room. For nearly an hour after the Vrakti delegation filed its formal complaint before the station even completed its night cycle. It was long and detailed and used a great deal of legal language, but its central demand was simple. It wanted Daniel Cole handed over for extradition and prosecution on charges of threatening a senior diplomatic representative. It also wanted Commander Lask formally censured for allowing a civilian to access a restricted corridor. The complaint landed on the cooperative station council before most of its members had finished their morning routines. The council chair, a large, gray-skinned Mureth named Vel sat on. Read it twice, then he called for an emergency session. Advisor Senova received her notification and arrived at the council chamber early. She sat at the far end of the table and arranged her notes and waited. Vel Sadon opened the session by reading the complaint into the record. Then he invited the Vrakti legal attaché, a narrow-faced creature named Roltava, to present the delegation's position, and Roltava stood and spoke for 12 minutes, citing cooperative statutes and diplomatic protection protocols. He was precise and unhurried and clearly expected the council to agree quickly. When he finished, Senova asked to speak. She did not argue against the complaint directly. She started somewhere else. She told the council that she wanted to place one set of numbers on the table before any decision was made. She said that in 40 years of human membership in the cooperative, she had compiled a record of every gray zone incident involving a human citizen, incidents where a member species representative or citizen had made unsanctioned physical contact with a human or caused harm to a human in a space where the gray zone clause applied. There were 63 of them. As she listed a few, a human cargo worker knocked off a platform by a Vrakti freight crew, a human child shoved by a Moor market vendor during a crowded event, a human medical technician struck during a dispute over treatment of a non-human patient, a human woman hit on the promenade of Relay Point Kestrel by a senior trade delegate. In all 63 cases, she said the human involved had filed a report and waited for the process to work. In all 63 cases, the gray zone clause had been applied and no action had been taken. In all 63 cases, the human had absorbed the outcome and continued their life on the station. This, she said, was case 64. And in case 64, something different had happened, not a weapon, not a fight, not a formal protest or a diplomatic incident filed through official channels. A human had walked into a room and had a conversation. That was all. She paused and let that sit. Velsidin asked what her point was. Senova said, "My point is that 63 times the system told human citizens that what happened to them did not qualify as a violation. 63 times they accepted that answer. The 64th time, one of them found another way. I am not asking the council to approve of that. I am asking the council to understand what it means that it took 64 incidents before it happened even once." The room was quiet for a moment. Roltava said that regardless of prior incidents, the current matter involved a clear threat to diplomatic representative and must be treated as such. Senova said, Delegate Vrathkul was not touched. He was not harmed by every legal measure available to this council. But he was spoken to. The question before us is not whether a law was broken. The question is what message this council sends when it decides how to respond. The session continued for another 2 hours. At the end of it, Velsidin called for a recess and a closed deliberation. While the council deliberated, Vrathkul was asked to appear before them to give his own account. This was standard procedure. He arrived with Roltava beside him and took his seat at the presentation table. He was different from the Vrathkul that colleagues had known for years. The difference was not dramatic, he sat. Correctly, he answered questions in full sentences, but the quality of his presence was changed. The weight that Senior Vrakti carried with them, the unspoken pressure of a creature that had never been made to feel small. I was still there, but it had a crack in it. Now, and through the crack, something else was visible that no one could quite name. Velsadin asked him to describe what had occurred in the suite. Vrathkul said that the human had entered and had spoken to him. Velsadin asked what the human had said. Vrathkul was quiet for a moment, then he said, he made the situation clear. Velsadin asked him to be specific. Vrathkul asked for a brief recess. He did not return for 40 minutes. When he did, he said only that he had nothing further to add to his account, and that he wished to return to the suite. The council allowed it. After he left, Senova said nothing. She did not need to. Every person in that room had watched a creature who had faced down fleet admirals and trade conglomerates and rival delegates for 30 years of diplomatic work sit in front of a council and be unable to describe conversation with a human engineer. The story reached the news feeds of 17 cooperative member worlds within 20 hours of the session. It traveled fast because it was the kind of story that traveled fast, the kind with a shape that people recognized even before they had all the details. The headline that appeared most often was simple: Human husband enters Vrakt the suite alone. Delegate recalled for review. In human communities across the cooperative, the response was quiet, not celebration, something more like recognition, a collective slow nod. Among non-human species, the response was harder to describe, and there were ancient species in the cooperative, species that had been traveling between stars for 10,000 years before humans left Earth, species that had looked at the early human records of what they had done to their own world and filed them under a simple category, manageable. Those species were looking at the news feeds now, and some of their scholars were pulling out old files and reading them again with different eyes. One Thessari cultural commentator published a short piece that was shared more widely than anything she had written before. It said, "We have spent 40 years watching humans adapt to the cooperative. We made the mistake of thinking adaptation meant acceptance. We did not ask what was underneath the patience. Now we know." On Relay Point Kestrel, in a plain room with a cot and a locked door, Nat Daniel Cole was sitting with his back against the wall and his eyes closed. He was not worried. He had done what needed doing. Whatever came next, he would handle it the same way he handled everything else. One thing at a time, starting with what was in front of him. What was in front of him right now was a wall, so he rested and he waited, and outside the station the stars did not move, and somewhere across the cooperative, in 17 different systems, people who had never met him were reading about what he had done and feeling something they had not felt in a long time. Something that rhymed with hope. The formal review of Daniel Cole's actions was held 3 days after the incident. It took place in the main hearing chamber on level 3, which was the largest formal room on Kestrel, and the chamber had tiered seating for observers and a central floor where the presenting party stood. The ceiling was high and the lighting was neutral, designed to suit no species in particular, and therefore acceptable to all. The chamber had more observers in it than it usually held, species that rarely attended cooperative proceedings, had sent representatives, some of them had come just to watch. That was unusual. Enough that Velsedin noted it in his opening remarks. The VRACT legal team was led by Roltava, who had spent the intervening days preparing a detailed case. He presented it methodically. The cooperative's diplomatic protection statutes were clear, he said. An accredited senior representative had been subject to intimidation by a private citizen inside a secure diplomatic zone. The fact that no physical contact occurred was beside the point. The intent to intimidate was the violation. The cooperative's stability depended on its member representatives being able to conduct their work without the threat of personal confrontation from civilians who disagreed with their actions. It was a good argument. It had logic to it. Several council members appeared to find it persuasive. Then Commander Lask gave his testimony. He stood at the center of the floor with his weight on his good leg, the way he always stood, and he spoke without notes. He said that in 30 years of security work he had processed hundreds of individuals for dozens of different infractions. He said that in all that time he could count on one hand the number of people who had come to him voluntarily before any report had been filed and before any warrant had been issued, and turned themselves in simply because they believed it was the right procedure. Daniel Cole, he said, had been one of those people. He said that when he sat across from Daniel in his office, he had heard a precise, honest, and complete account of what happened, with nothing removed and nothing added. He said that in his personal judgment, whatever had been said in that suite had not been a threat in any sense he recognized from his training or his experience. It had been, as best he could determine, a man telling another man the truth. He said, "I have worked alongside humans on this station for 9 years. I have worked alongside VRACT, Thesari, Moore, and 7 other species. In my experience, the thing most likely to de-escalate a dangerous situation is not protocol, it is honesty. Hey, what Daniel Cole did was unconventional. It was also the most honest thing that had happened in this matter since it began." He thanked the council and returned to his seat. Senova spoke next. She did not repeat her arguments from the earlier session. Instead, she placed one document on the record. It was a summary she had written herself, pulling data from cooperative incident logs over the previous 40 years. It showed in plain numbers how many times human citizens had been subject to gray zone incidents, how many times they had filed reports, how many times those reports had resulted in any action, and how many times those citizens had chosen any method other than the official process to seek resolution. 63 incidents, 63 reports, 0 resolutions, 0 alternative methods chosen until case 64. As she said, the council should understand that this is not a story about one man deciding to take matters into his own hands. This is a story about a system that spent 40 years telling people that what happened to them did not qualify as a problem, and the 64th person who heard that answer finally found a different question to ask. She sat down. Daniel was invited to speak last. He stood at the center of the floor and looked at the council without any visible nervousness. He was wearing the same kind of clothes He always wore, plain and practical, with the station maintenance patch still on his jacket because no one had told him to remove it. He said, "I know the correct process. My wife knows it better than I do. She works for the Integration Bureau, and she has spent years helping this cooperative function well. When she was struck on the promenade, she filed a report. She did the right thing. The process told her the right thing was not enough." He said, "I am not standing here to say I was right to go to that suite. I am standing here to say that what I found in that room was a being who had never once in his life been asked to consider what it cost when he used his size against someone who did not have any. I did not hurt him. I did not threaten him with anything outside the room. I told him the truth about what he had taken from my wife that morning, and I told him that he had been wrong to believe there was no one in that corridor he needed to account to." He paused. He said, "I am sorry the method was outside the rules. I am not sorry for the conversation." Then he sat down. The council deliberated for 3 days, and on the morning of the 4th day, Valseddon read the decision into the record. Daniel Cole was formally cautioned for conduct outside standard grievance procedures. A caution was the lightest available sanction, one step above a notation. It carried no suspension, no fine, no restriction of station access. In the same ruling, the gray zone clause was suspended immediately pending comprehensive legal review. The suspension was retroactive, which reclassified the original incident involving Laura Cole as an actionable assault under cooperative law. Delegate Vrathkal was to be recalled to the Vrakti homeworld for internal review of his conduct. The cooperative communique used careful diplomatic language, but the meaning was plain enough. The Vrakti had decided they would rather handle the matter themselves than learn how many more conversations like the one in the suite might be waiting for them. Roltava accepted the decision in formal silence, which was the Vrakti way of registering disagreement without escalating it. He left the chamber without speaking to anyone. Senova filed her full report. That evening it was 17 pages. She spent most of those pages being precise and analytical and careful, as she always was. The last paragraph was different. It was the one that would be quoted in papers and briefings and training materials for the next decade. It said in part, "Humans are not the strongest species in the cooperative. They are not the fastest or the most armored or the longest lived. And what they are is something our models have consistently failed to account for. They are patient in a way that resembles acceptance but is not the same thing. They build bonds with the people they choose that do not weaken under pressure. And when something they love is harmed, they become briefly and completely and very quietly the most purposeful thing in any room they choose to walk into. We have observed this. We recommend all member species update their assessments accordingly." She submitted the report and turned off her office light and went home. On level 9, Daniel Cole walked out of the security processing office into the main corridor. The caution had been entered into his file and his station access had been restored, and there was nothing left to do except go home. Laura was standing outside the security office door. She had a container of food from the level 7 thesauri stall. the one with the rice dish she liked. She handed it to him. He took it. They walked together through the main corridor toward the transit tubes. They passed through the promenade level, the same one where it had happened, under the same high ceiling with the same market stalls and the same shifting light and the same 100 species going about their evening. No one stopped them. A few people looked, most of them were not looking in the way people look at something strange. They were looking in the way people look at something they are glad to see. Daniel and Laura did not talk about the hearing or the decision or what came next. Those were things for tomorrow. Tonight they walked side by side down the long promenade, and Laura held his hand and he held hers, and the lights in the corridor shifted slowly from gold into amber, the way they always did at the end of the station's day. Outside the station, the dark between stars was very old and very large. Inside, two people shared a meal, and the universe, enormous and indifferent, and full of species that were still deciding what to think of humanity, turned slowly around them. Nobody bothered them. Nobody would.